Welcome to our first example problem video. These videos are meant to help serve as a reference for you guys when working on the homework sets that I assign, and are also designed to give you guys an idea of what type of work I expect you to show when you complete the take-home exams that will come later on in this course. Alright, let's get started. So the first thing that we want to cover, the first of these example problems, is going to be covering the product rule. So, the product rule is something that we covered quite a while ago, several weeks ago before spring break, and there are a couple problems involving it on this week's homework set. Before we get to the problems themselves, it's helpful to write down what the product rule itself actually says. The product rule tells us how to deal with derivatives in cases where you have two functions, let's call them f of x and g of x, that are multiplied together. And the product rule simply states that if you're trying to find the derivative of f times g, then that's going to be the derivative of f, or f prime of x, times g of x, plus the derivative of g of x, in other words, g prime of x, times f of x. In other words, the product rule states that the derivative of one function multiplied by another is the derivative of the first times the second, plus the derivative of the second times the first. Alright, I've written this up in red, and I'm going to leave this up here throughout the remainder of this video for you guys to look at. Alright, let's jump right into an easy in quotes problem. Alright, this is going to be a very straightforward problem intended only to show you guys how this works. Let's say I asked you guys to find the derivative so find d dx of the function x e to the x. Okay, so the first step that you need to be able to accomplish when attacking a problem like this is to recognize that you need the product rule at all. Remember, not all questions will tell you what rules you need to apply. You need to be able to figure out and to determine which rules you're going to need for any given problem just by looking at the function that you're working with. Okay, so the first step in order to determine that you need to use the product rule is to compare the function that you are given to the function that product rule applies to. Now, if we look at our formula written at the top in red, we see that we are always working with two functions. This first one in the blue box is f of x. That's what I'm going to call it anyways. And the second one that I shall put in the green box is g of x. Now, in the function we are given, we also have two functions, x and e to the x. And the key here is that just like in our formula up top where we are multiplying these two functions together, we are also multiplying the function x by the function e to the x. Once you've identified which functions, or rather once you've identified which rule you need to use, the very first thing you should do is to write down the functions that you are dealing with. In blue, I'm going to write down f of x so that everything remains color-coded. And we can see that in this case, f of x refers to the function x. In green, we have the function g of x. And we can see that in this case, our function g of x is the function e to the x. Okay, so we know these are our two functions we're working with, and we know that these are being multiplied together, so we need to use the product rule. Now, the very next step, every single time you work on any product rule problem, should be, before you do anything else, to write out what the derivatives of f of x and g of x are. Write these down, just the way I'm about to do. So the first thing is, we know that f of x is equal to x, and that means that its derivative, f prime of x, is equal to 1. We know this by the power rule. Second, we know our function g of x is equal to e to the x, so that means that its derivative, g prime of x, is also equal to e to the x, and we know this by the exponential rule. Okay. Next, I want you guys to write down in full the entirety of product rule. I know this sounds like a lot of work. I know that this sounds perhaps unnecessary. But the reason that we do this is that it makes the actual work that you're going to need to do next, it reduces this simply to plugging in and writing things out. So I'm going to write out this rule. This is the exact same thing as in red up top. And I'm now going to color code exactly the things that we need. So we see that in the first place here, we have f prime of x. This is what I've color coded in red. And this is being multiplied by g of x, which is what I've color coded in green. Next up, we have g prime of x, which is what I've color coded in yellow, times f of x, which is what I've color coded in blue. All right, we're now at the last step, believe it or not. All we need to do is plug everything in. Don't forget your parentheses. Always put parentheses around each of these terms before you write them out. In the first position, we see that we have what we need in red, f prime of x, which is equal to 1. We are multiplying this by what I color-coded in green, which is g of x, and that's equal to e to the x. Next up, we have an addition, followed by what we've color-coded in yellow, which is g prime of x, which is equal to e to the x. And last but not least, we have what I color-coded in blue, which is f of x, in other words, x. And we are done. That's all there is to it. If you write everything out over here first, always do this first. If you write this all out and then write out the formula that you're working with, the only thing you need to do after that is plug everything in the right spot, and don't forget your parentheses. As long as you do this, you will greatly reduce the number of mistakes you make on these problems, and it makes anybody grading you, gives them a very easy time grading your work because they can see exactly what you did and know exactly how you got to the answer that you did. Okay, so like I said, that was an easy problem. I'm going to leave this up as much as I can, but it's useful to at least look at a problem that perhaps is a little bit more difficult. If not more difficult, then maybe, at first glance at least, a little bit more involved. So I'm going to call this a bit of a harder problem. And the only reason that I'm going to say this problem is harder is that the functions involved are maybe a little bit more complicated. So again, I'm just asking for a derivative, in other words, to find d dx. And this time I'm going to have the function be square root of x times, in parentheses, x squared plus 5x minus 1. Okay. So once again, how do we know that we need the product rule for this problem? Well, first off, we immediately see that we are working with two different functions. I'm going to color code these in the same way that I did before. In the first position in blue, we have the function square root of x. That's going to be the function we're going to call f here. In the second position, in green, we have the function x squared plus 5x minus 1. We're going to call this one g of x. Now we know that this is going to require product rule because these two functions we're working with are being multiplied together. Whenever there's a multiplication, you know you have to use product rule. Okay, let's write our functions out. First off, we have the function f of x, which is equal to square root of x. Now when we're doing calculus, it's often helpful to rewrite square root of x as the power 1/2. All right, second off, we have our function in green, g of x, which is equal to x squared plus 5x minus 1. All right. Again, the very first thing you want to do at this point is to write down the derivatives of these two functions. Now, if f of x is equal to x to the 1/2, then you know by the power rule that its derivative f prime of x is going to be 1/2 times x to the negative 1/2. If you're not certain how I got this, try applying power rule to x to the 1/2 on your own and working it through. You should be able to get to this answer. Okay, second off, we have the derivative of our function g. If g of x is equal to x squared plus 5x minus 1, then again by power rule, we get that the derivative of g of x is going to be 2x plus 5. Okay, I'm going to move over here now. And again, remember that I want you guys next to rewrite this exactly as the formula for product rule. It's important to do this because it makes the next step extremely easy. So we know that this is going to be equal to f prime of x times g of x plus g prime of x times f of x. All right, I'm going to color code these as well, just so that it's amply clear exactly what's going where. So f prime of x we put in red, g of x we put in green, g prime of x we put in yellow, and f of x I put in blue. All right, all that's left for us to do is to plug all of this in, and I'm going to try to stick to the color scheme once again. All right, we have first off in red our function f prime of x, which is 1/2 times x to the negative 1/2. Next off, we have our function in green, which is x squared plus 5x minus 1. Next, we have just an addition sign. We are adding, followed by our function in yellow, which is 2x plus 5. And last but not least, we have our function in blue, which is, you can write it either way you prefer. I'm going to write this as x to the 1/2. You can write this as square root of x as well. Either way works. And we are done. All right. That's all there is to these problems. Just make sure that you practice good bookkeeping. Write down the functions you're working with, write down their derivatives, and write out the product rule. Then after that, all you need to do is plug things in the right spot. And again, don't forget your parentheses. All right, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's all I've got for product rule. Bye-bye.